This is Primmie. He's one of the most gifted Valorant players ever. He went straight from ranked right to playing as a pro in tier 1 and started dominating instantly. A ton of people have tried to figure out what makes him so good, but until now nobody has analyzed every frame of his gameplay to find out how us normies can play like him. So today we're trying to answer this question: what does Primmie do differently? And can we measure it? To do that, I'm pitting pro Valorant player Primmie against the silver player Eokpoke by analyzing 3,108 frames of their gunfights, and the results may surprise you. Here's how my analysis works. I looked at 159 gunfights. Each one goes into one of two groups, peaks or holds. A peak is when the player starts the fight by swinging an angle. A hold is when the player is holding an angle, waiting for the enemy to swing. This matters because peaks and holds require slightly different crosshair placement. Alright, now let's see how a pro player compares against a silver player. When we look at Primmie versus Eokpoke on holds, the first thing that stands out is crosshair placement. And when it comes to crosshair placement, there are two measurements we want to look for. First, a good hold starts with a good setup, and the difference between our setup and where we initially shoot is called the hold correction. To measure hold correction, I overlay the frame where the enemy first appears with the frame where the first shot is fired. That lets me see exactly how much the crosshair moved between those two moments. To measure first shot accuracy, I then measure the distance from the crosshair and the enemy's head for the first shot. Lastly, instead of just using raw pixels, I normalize that distance by head size. And by normalize, I mean I divide the first shot accuracy distance by the size of the enemy head in that frame. This is because missing by 10 pixels up close is very different than missing by 10 pixels at long range. A miss by 10 pixels up close is tiny. A miss by 10 pixels when peeking C long on Haven is a pretty big miss. To put it simply, the better the setup, the smaller the hold correction. And the smaller the hold correction, the easier it is to secure the kill, the easier it is to win the gunfight. So let's compare the two players. As you can see, Primmie's hold correction is 1.1, that's 1.1 heads, and Eokpoke's median hold correction is 1.66, which means that Primmie is 66% better than Eokpoke in terms of hold corrections. As you can see, Primmie's hold corrections are tiny. They're 66% smaller than Eokpoke's. His median correction is 1.1 of a head. That's almost no movement. That means Primmie's crosshair moves 66% less than Eokpoke when he's setting up for a hold. He's barely moving his crosshair. Imagine how accurate and consistent you would be if you could hold an angle and barely have to move your crosshair and have it right where the enemy's head is going to be. Because of this, Primmie's holds are lethal, and I saw that when I was analyzing his gameplay. Alright, now let's compare the second key measurement in crosshair placement, first shot accuracy. This is the measurement of the crosshair to the head location when the player takes their first shot. Similar to Kayak versus Path in my last video, we actually don't see a real difference in first shot accuracy. Primmie and Eokpoke are really not that far apart. 1.12 for Primmie and 1.17 for Eokpoke. That's 0.05 of a head. That's basically measurement error. Now we don't see much of a difference in reaction time here either. That's interesting because in the previous analysis with Kayak, first shot accuracy was similar between him and the gold player, but Kayak was able to do it in significantly faster time. We're not seeing that here between Primmie and Eokpoke. My guess is, and this is the guess for a lot of this, is that we're ultimately dealing with smaller sample sizes. So it's harder to get signal, and sometimes we just get some randomness. And that's really part of why I'm building Training Arc. As you can imagine, analyzing Valorant gunfights frame by frame is a ton of work. It's super time intensive. In fact, it took me over 10 hours to analyze Primmie's gunfights alone. But it's critical that I do this right, because not only do I want to be a better Valorant player, I want to help you be a better Valorant player too. And to do that, I've invested over 150 grand of my own money to create an AI Valorant coach named Training Arc. By analyzing pros like Primmie and Kayak, I'm able to teach Training Arc what makes certain players so cracked, so that Training Arc can coach us normies on how to be even better at Valorant. Right now, Training Arc is great at analyzing gunfight hygiene, things like, did you crouch spray instantly during a fight, or did you shoot while moving? And if you want your gunfight hygiene analyzed, click the link in the description to join the beta now. Now let's get back into it and see how Primmie and Eokpoke compare on peaks, because this is where speed really matters. A peak is when the player starts the fight by pre-aiming and then swinging an angle. So the first place to look is setup. Did Eokpoke and Primmie have similar setups? Let's have a look. If you look at the numbers, Primmie had slightly better setups. If you look at his mean or average peak error, it was 7.73 versus 11.45. If you look at his median peak error, it's 3.5 versus 3.81 for Eogpoke. That makes sense. We'd expect Primmie to have better pre-aim, and we see that in the data, because better pre-aim means smaller peak error. But what about execution? How well did they balance the trade-off between first shot accuracy and reaction time? So this is where we see a meaningful difference between Primmie and Eogpoke. Primmie is 13% more accurate in terms of execution. You might not think that's huge, but you have to remember that he's also doing this in Radiant lobbies. So these comparisons aren't apples to apples. This is like comparing Formula 1 to go-kart racing. But there's another piece over and above accuracy, reaction time. And this is where Primmie really blows Eogpoke out of the water. He's 13% more accurate in 50 milliseconds less time. That's a fundamental difference in mechanics. But the one thing we've been missing is that we've been digging into just holds and peaks individually. And medians and averages, while helpful, they don't tell the whole story. And there's one more tool in the toolbox that's super helpful for us to understand what are called distributions. I'd forgotten about this one, but it really actually helps tell the story. If you remember this fondly, maybe from your statistics classes, that's right, histograms. And what we'll see is so interesting. Primmie is in blue and Eogpoke is in red. And you can see that the medians and averages only tell part of the story here. Primmie has a few fights under 100 milliseconds reaction time, and you'll see he has a bunch of fights in the 150 to 200 and 200 to 250 millisecond buckets. Contrast that with Eogpoke, who has most of his fights in the 250 to 400 millisecond range. I actually think the histogram in this case tells the reaction time story better than I was able to before. And the big takeaway here is to just notice how far left shifted Primmie's histogram is versus Eogpoke's. Now, before we get into what this means for our own gameplay, I thought of something. How does Primmie compare to the previous pro we did, Kayak? A pro versus another pro. Who wins 1v1? I wasn't planning on doing this for this video, but it's just too tempting. Could we learn anything from comparing these two pros that we can then apply to our own gameplay to make it better? Well, let's find out. All right, Primmie versus Kayak. Primmie, the ranked legend who stepped straight from ranked into VCT Pro Tier 1 play. And Kayak, the star duelist who demolished in his first season, stepping into legend Jerka's big shoes. How do they compare? Let's start with one number. On peaks, Primmie is about 70 milliseconds faster than Kayak. You can see that here. For peaks, his median reaction time is about 283 milliseconds. Kayak's median reaction time is 350 milliseconds. That's a big gap. In Valorant, that often decides who shoots first, and in this case, Primmie shoots first. We can see more of that in this histogram. See, it's useful. We can see that Primmie's peaks are in the 200 to 300 millisecond bucket, but he has several peaks to the left of that. In contrast, Kayak is reliably in the 300 to 400 millisecond bucket. The thing is to notice the overall shape. Primmie is shifted left of Kayak, while both have a longer right tail. But then here's the question, is Primmie more accurate? That's where we see they're basically the same. 1 pixel isn't a significant difference. You'll remember in the Kayak video, we didn't normalize by heads. So goodbye normalization, we're back to good old pixels. Sorry, not sorry. So the next difference is peak error. And you can see here, the difference is significant. Primmie's peak error is around 31 pixels, whereas Kayak's peak error is around 46.49 pixels. Generally then, you would say Kayak takes peaks that are harder based on the mean of peak error. And again, peak error, that's how close the crosshair is to the enemy's head right when they first see them. The bigger the number, the harder the peak. So Primmie's peaks are easier than Kayak's, but here's where it gets interesting. When Kayak takes harder peaks, his reaction time barely changes. Check it out. R-squared shows how much of one thing explains another variable. So the larger the peak error is, the longer the reaction time is for Primmie. He has an R-squared of 0.242. with a positive correlation. But that's not the case for Kayak. When Kayak has a harder peak, when there's a larger peak error, his reaction time, while slightly slower than Primmie, is basically unaffected. It doesn't really matter how hard the peak is for Kayak, and you can see that because his R-squared is 0.05. Basically, it's not correlated at all with how large the peak error is, or how difficult the peak is. Primmie, though, is different. Even though he's faster overall, when his peaks get harder, his reaction slows down. So on peaks, Primmie wins on speed, but Kayak wins on robot-like consistency even when he's put in a difficult situation. And here's what I don't know the answer to. Which one do you think is more valuable? What do you think? It gets even more interesting when we look at holds. The first thing that stands out is hold correction. Primmie's hold corrections are seriously tiny. His crosshair barely moves when the enemy appears. Look at his median hold correction. That's how much he adjusts his crosshair from first seeing the enemy to shooting. It's 10.4 pixels. It makes sense then why his median reaction time is 50 milliseconds faster than Kayak. So same story, they're still roughly the same in terms of first shot accuracy. And in terms of reaction time, Primmie again is about 50 milliseconds faster. But there's another wrinkle to this story. Those darn correlations again. What's really interesting here is that when there's a larger hold correction, i.e. the hold was harder, Primmie reacts slower. There's a positive correlation. 42.3 of his reaction time is explained by hold correction. Kayak is the same as before. He doesn't really change whether it's easy or hard. We see the same pattern again. Primmie is faster and parts that because most of the time he basically doesn't need to move his mouse. Kayak is steadier. His reaction time doesn't change even when he has to make larger corrections. There are the same fights, same game, but very different styles here. And at this point, I had to stop and ask a real question. Did I get Kayak's data right? Is Primmie really this much faster than Kayak, or did I just measure Kayak wrong? If I measured everything again, would I get the same results? And more importantly, is Primmie really this good? So I remeasured Kayak's gunfights just to be safe, and the numbers didn't change. The measurements are accurate to what I measured before, to about plus or minus 16 milliseconds. That's one frame. So that doesn't explain the gaps we're seeing. So this isn't a mistake. It isn't noise. Primmie really is that fast. The data holds up. So how do we make sense of this data? One explanation about why he's so fast is audio. I went back and checked in one instance where he's getting crunched on sight as a KJ. He knows the guy's coming, and so his reaction is 117 milliseconds. I checked this 3 or 4 times. And at that point, that's less reaction time and more about putting himself in positions where he can capitalize and take advantage of his raw mechanics. And that helps explain 2 things. 1, why Primmie is so fast, and 2, why there's more spread in his reactions. Primmie's style and his mechanics change depending on the difficulty of the fight. Kayak, though, is different. No matter how hard the gunfight is, his reaction time barely changes. So this isn't about who's better, it's more about style or archetype. Primmie plays on speed and timing, whereas Kayak plays on machine-like consistency. Same game, same fights, but very different ways to win. There's a reason they're the best, but I think it's fascinating that they do it in different ways. Now, this is all super exciting, but how can this actually help improve our own Valorant gameplay? It's clear Primmie and Kayak aren't human, but we've learned something super important here about the future of Training Arc. First, it tells us we're on the right track. We can break down crosshair placement and gunfight technique in a way that actually reveals differences between top players. Not just who's better, but how they win. The next step is scale. We can do this for more pros. We can see whether Primmie and Kayak are edge cases, or if they're examples of different archetypes that show up again and again. Because what this data really shows is that there isn't one correct way to win gunfights. There are different styles. Speed and timing, that's Primmie. Consistency and control, that's Kayak. And most players are somewhere in between. The problem is we can't discover or coach that at scale by doing this manually. And that's where Training Arc comes in. Training Arc is about finding your pattern, how you naturally take fights, and then helping you lean into it instead of fighting it. That's how we're gonna help players win more gunfights. Let me know if you want more deep analysis like this by giving a thumbs up or a comment. Let us know any other pros you'd like me to review. Subscribe for more Training Arc updates. And if you wanna see how I figure out how to measure crosshair placement in the first place, then watch this video next.